No one could have ruined Thanksgiving more than our brother did. Alan said he was getting clean again. This time, he really meant it. He had already checked into rehab and was meeting with his counselor twice a week. He told us that he loved us. Everything from the moment he trudged through the front door and struggled threading his coat over the lone hanger in the closet suggested it was just another one of his tall tales. Tate had made it very clear in the days leading up to Thanksgiving that he was opposed to inviting our older brother over. And deep down, I knew it was a bad idea too. Whenever Alan came back telling us that he was trying to turn his life around, it really meant that he needed us for something. Alan had been a bad egg for the family since our parents died in a car accident while we were boys, and our grandparents stepped up to take us in. He'd been pulling the same bullshit throughout his adolescence, with our grandparents too old and beaten down to rein in on him. So many nights of our teenage years, Tate and I would stay in playing Xbox and watching DVDs only to brace ourselves when he heard footfalls coming up the porch and Alan stumbled in, fucked up and always angry. When our grandparents finally passed, all they had left in their estate was the house to pass down to us. It hadn't taken long for us to grow so sick of the constant parties and Alan's strung-out junkie friends passed out on the couch every night that we eventually had to kick him out and try to make our own. 1/3 share of the decaying 2-story house, smack in the middle of St. Paul suburbia, wasn't worth much. It was maybe enough money to float his drug and escort expenses for a couple of months at the most. Wherever the money had gone, it was clear that it had run out by the time that Thanksgiving rolled around. We'd broken our golden rule and opened our doors to him one more time. We'd even tried to take it seriously that year. I'd ordered an organic turkey from a special grocer, and Tate had spent hours preparing sides of potatoes, stuffing, broccoli, salad, and even baked an apple pie for dessert. Alan showed his immense appreciation by wobbling while he struggled to keep his balance in the front hall. His eyes were red around the edges, and he scratched the left side of his cheek like he needed to peel off the outer layer of skin. His plaid shirt and jeans, with paint stains all around the knees, looked like they were on their 10th time being worn without a wash. His eyelids twitched. He looked all over the room like he had trouble making out the familiar shapes around him. He smiled at us, and we feigned smiles back. We were both so nervous, just how far off the deep end would this night go? Perhaps we'd have to physically force him out if things got out of hand. Make sure the house was dry. He even hid the wine and whiskey glasses so we couldn't get inspired. There was a glass pitcher with ice water smack in the middle of the table, and that's all that the three of us would have to drink that night. "You want to sit on the couch?" Tate gestured towards the living room and then headed back for the kitchen. "Dinner's almost ready. Just need to set the table and I'll bring everything out." Alan stared at the dinner table like the idea of sitting down scared him half to death. "Nah, bro. I'll stand for now." He kept fidgeting at the front door. He kept looking over his shoulder and out the window. Like even he knew that this whole thing was a bad idea. He should just make an excuse to jump ship for all of our sakes. "Just gotta get something out of my car. I'll be right back." He slammed the door behind him before either of us had a chance to answer. We looked at each other and shrugged. The whole thing was all too expected, like we were reading from a script. He probably wanted an extra hit of whatever he'd been on all day before he could stomach sitting down for a period of longer than 15 minutes. There's nothing we could do about it aside from not let it bother us. I started setting cutlery, and Tate brought the food dishes over one by one. The arrangement looked elegant when it was complete. Our late grandmother would have been proud if she was still around to see it. We gave Alan another 5 minutes before we started eating without him. It wasn't something that needed to be debated. We didn't need to bother checking on him to see if he was coming back. The food would only get colder, with more time spent on a wasted cause. We scooped big portions onto our plate, and we started digging in. Eating with just the two of us didn't hurt that badly. I mean, it never does when you prep yourself for the worst case scenario ahead of time. We both loosened our belts and sat there at the table for some time when we were done. Every once in a while, I would glance over to the door, waiting for a moment where Alan would burst in like nothing had happened, with some cooked-up story about how he got a call from a friend in need, or how he couldn't find whatever the hell he was looking for in his car. And then it hit me. That degenerate didn't have a car. He'd never owned one. He hadn't even tried to get his license, as best as I could remember. I went to the front window and peered out. The driveway was empty, as I'm sure it had been the entire time. Alan probably had one of his junkie friends drop him off, or he just walked all the way from whatever ghetto part of town he'd lived in. Probably took off down the street the moment that he realized he wasn't mentally stable enough to sit down for a proper dinner with his brothers. It seemed like all the neighbors were entertaining Thanksgiving company, with their narrow driveways on sprawling city lots stuffed with 3 or 4 cars at least. A single black van was parked on the street directly in front of our house. It's one of those 90s GMC Savannas with no windows lining in the back. I pictured Alan hunched over inside, desperately taking another hit before he could find the confidence to come back in. The van shook, gently, but no door ever opened. I drew the curtains shut, and then my phone started buzzing on the counter where I'd left it, trying not to distract myself from other precious family meals. Sure enough, it was Alan's phone, and the rational part of me was screaming to let it go to voicemail. Then again, maybe I'd found the confidence to tell him how I truly felt over the phone. The cat always seemed to have my tongue whenever I saw him in person. At first, all I heard were gasps on the other end of the line. When Alan's voice finally came through, it was shrill and desperate. Something was wrong. He didn't have the finesse to fake it all that well. He stumbled over his words and couldn't find a way to string more than a couple together at a time. It was so predictably infuriating. He'd managed to fuck himself up swiftly. And I didn't want to piss away any more time trying to figure out what was wrong with him. I wished I could have been jaded enough to just hang up the phone right then and there. I glanced back at Tate, who slouched forward in his chair with his elbows on his knees. He stared back at me apathetically, no more interested in the gibberish he could hear coming from the other line. When Alan was finally able to find his words, he was suddenly composed. "Y'all to come to the reservoir behind the house. Come down here to stretch my legs and slipped. Need some help getting up." "The fuck are you doing back at the reservoir, Alan? You said you were going to your car and there's nothing in the goddamn driveway." "Need to stretch my legs." "Sorry, brother. I need you to come back and help me up. Messed up my ankle real good." "Get your ass up and hobble back here yourself. We'll pack you a doggy bag and you can walk your ass home." Suddenly Alan's voice became very stern, threatening even. "Listen, brother. You and Tate walk down here to the reservoir now, or I'm going to call up my junkie friends to go over there and make you. Y'all like that?" I looked at Tate again, and it was clear he could still hear Alan word for word. He got up from his seat and went to put his jacket on. I stood there speechless. Alan erupted into a burst of shrill laughter on the other end of the line, like he'd gotten the upper hand. He hung up before I could find any more words. "What are we gonna do?" I asked Tate, while he fished through the front cupboard looking for gloves and a hat. "I guess we'll go down to the reservoir." The reservoir was a 1/4-mile walk downhill from the end of our backyard. I'd always felt lucky that we had it there. I meant, our property was one of the rare spots in the city where we didn't have neighbors towering over our backyard. I'd fished some old flashlights out from underneath the kitchen sink, and both of us hopped over and headed back. It was surprising Alan would have made it back here on his own. He would have been forced to hop a fence somewhere. I wondered what condition we'd find him in. Maybe he'd be lying on his back, flailing in the dirt after the adrenaline rush that he had on the phone had faded. Maybe he'd be sitting calmly on one of the concrete slabs, trying to downplay the whole thing and claim that I was overreacting. It was surprisingly dark once we got down there. I suppose we were far enough away from any of the suburb streets to get much illumination. We panned the flashlights all over the empty space. Saw the familiar concrete blocks with little weeds poking out between them, all the way down to the sewer opening. Cars whizzed by on the overpass a couple of blocks to the west. Everything looked as was it should. Except, Alan was nowhere to be seen. "Fucker," Tate said under his breath. "He's never where he says he is." there wasn't any use in pissing away any more time looking for him. We started our way back towards the house. Wherever Alan was, and however he had made his distress so convincing over the phone, we weren't going to let it be our problem anymore. I was determined to draw my line in the sand from that point forward and make sure that I wouldn't let my older brother or his predictable actions invade my thoughts for the remainder of the evening. The plan lasted maybe 2 minutes. We realized that Alan had once again fucked us over before we even made it inside the house. The rear door had even been left swinging open in the cold November air. The whole place had been ravaged. All the dishes had been knocked off the table with the leftovers smeared deliberately all over the floor. Pictures had been pulled off the wall, and all the cupboard drawers had been yanked out and tossed around. Tate dashed to the front door, which had also been left hanging open, and locked it. I ran to the garage to grab 2 baseball bats, which I was thankful hadn't been stolen. We went through the house together, slowly growing more horrified as we realized that everything portable and remotely valuable had been taken. Even our grandmother's gold necklace, which she had passed to her mother and then passed back to her, was gone. We kept it in a little nook behind the fireplace for that very reason of mitigating it being stolen. Only Alan, or someone who knew us well, could have thought to look there. Amid all the contempt that I felt towards my older brother in that moment, I was amazed he had composed himself well enough to divert us so convincingly, and even further, impressed that he was so quick to clean us out. We were gone out of the house for 7 or 8 minutes, at the most. He'd made remarkably quick work of it. Suppose that kind of talent came with time and practice. Tate and I said very little to each other for the remainder of the evening. We picked up as best we could and made our way to bed, both of us taking our baseball bats with us for protection. I triple-checked that every door and window was locked before turning out the lights. I'd be damned if I ever let that fucker step foot in the house again. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I'd spent more time tossing and turning than I did lying still. The anger had seeped down to my core and rotted my thoughts from the inside out. For whatever little amount of time I managed to stay asleep, the resentment towards my older brother found its way to wriggle into every corner of my dream. It was exactly 2 a.m. when I first started hearing the tapping. It didn't feel real at first, more like I was still half stuck in the midst of one of my nightmares. However, the longer it persisted, the more impossible it became to ignore. I was particularly grateful for a purpose to get out of bed. I thought maybe the wind was blowing the tops of one of the trees, and it was scattered across the backyard against the window. I drew the curtains, thinking nothing of it at first, when I saw Alan standing there at the 2nd-story level. I would have thought that I was still dreaming, had my heart not skipped several beats. The window occupied the upper 2/3 portion of the wall. There was a narrow ledge of brick lining the outside that you could maybe get just enough of your toes on top of to support your weight. And even then, it couldn't explain how he'd managed to climb up there in the first place. There was no access point that I could think of. His head was maybe a foot or 2 above mine. His skin looked sickly white in the pale light from the street. He looked back at me with dead eyes. The look of a man strung out and barely in touch with the reality around him. The kind of semi-catatonic state that you would need to be in to think that climbing up there was a good idea in the first place. I took a step back, and he leaned forward and pressed his cheek against the glass. I tried to scream for Tate, but no sound escaped my mouth. Was my older brother seriously about to break in through the 2nd-story window? He had tried all entry points of the 1st floor and was now resorting to checking if I'd overlooked locking one of the windows on the 2nd? His hand stretched to the far right end. It looked like he was trying to wedge his fingers into the crack between the window and the wall. The rage that had been bottled up within me the entire night started to spill out. No social restraint could hold it back right then and there. I started punching the glass and driving my shoulder into it. I tried to create enough force to startle him enough so he would lose his grip and fall back to the lawn below. "Fuck you, Alan! Fuck you!" I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I launched myself harder into the glass. Still, he didn't budge. It's almost like he didn't acknowledge that I was even there. He was so focused on that space between the wall and the edge of the window. The commotion had been enough to wake Tate up. His footsteps pounded from the room over until he was right up next to me. He looked at me in a state of horror and disbelief. "That asshole's still trying to get in," I said weakly. "What asshole?" Tate asked. I turned back to the window and I saw the space was empty. It was the same for the lawn below and all the surrounding area that we could see. There was no indent on the glass, no scruff marks anywhere that would suggest that he'd fallen back and managed to quickly scurry away. I didn't press hard trying to explain to Tate what I'd seen in the window, but I managed to convince him to camp out in my room for the remainder of the night. I wouldn't let myself sleep another wink. I was doubtful I could even if I tried. We both sat on the floor of my bedroom with our backs against the wall and our bats in between our legs. I kept staring out the window, part of me deep down expecting Alan to try his luck climbing up again. We debated calling the cops at first, but we figured that it wouldn't get us very far unless we could actually track him down. There was still part of me worried about Alan's health, even though it was vastly overshadowed by my innate desire to self-protect. If there was any silver lining in all this madness, it was that there was a distant brotherly bond that had only been strengthened that night between Tate and me. And it all spawned from the disdain from our older brother. Just as it always had. And that it always would. It didn't seem like such a long time before the night sky finally started to brighten. Tops of the trees in the backyard started to show their texture, and I could even see back to the reservoir. I might have suggested that we bundled up and walk somewhere high enough where we could be able to catch the sunrise. We could stop somewhere for an early Black Friday breakfast. We both jumped to our feet, ready and able to fight Alan off if he were going to force another confrontation. Footsteps sounded around the side of the house, and then towards the front door, and then, very faintly, a hushed voice whispered something that I couldn't make out. We didn't waste any time. We stormed downstairs with our bats brandished and ready to strike Alan down. There'd be no second guessing this time. Everything was remarkably still on the first floor when we arrived. We tiptoed to the front hall, hoping he'd been foolish enough to stay there, thinking that we hadn't heard him. And right before we reached it, we heard that same voice on the other side. Tate looked at me and nodded. We clutched our bats and unlocked the front door. He tried to push it open, but it didn't budge. He checked the lock again and shook his head. He leaned into it harder the second time, but it still didn't move. I tried pushing with him, and it felt like we were pressing against a brick wall. Something was very wrong. Alan wasn't strong enough to hold the door up against us, even if he tried. We had been barricaded in. There was no other explanation. And that's when I noticed the proof in our surroundings. There was very little of the morning light flooding in downstairs. All the windows, whichever ones weren't already covered by curtains, had been boarded over. No, I said in a panicked voice, and moved to the main floor looking for an exit that wasn't blocked. Why would that asshole lock us in? Tate looked at me, and for the first time in years, I thought I might catch him crying. Did you hear anything during the night? How could he do it so fast? He asked. Come, follow me, I'll show you. Alan's voice sounded shrill from the top of the stairs, like he had been waiting for that exact question. We both sprinted to the bottom steps, and sure enough, we saw our sickly-looking older brother staring down at us from the top. He looked so apathetic, like his sneaking in our house to torture us was so easy it hardly amused him anymore. We stormed up towards him. Both our bats were raised, and there was no doubt in my mind that we would have beaten him within an inch of his life if we could have gotten our hands on him. He darted from my room, and we followed, gaining more ground with each step. He had the window wedged all the way open. He hurtled out of it with incredible finesse and landed squarely on his feet in the back lawn. He kept running. Without breaking his stride, and he hopped the fence like it was nothing. He was halfway towards the reservoir while Tate and I were still trying to figure out how we would shimmy ourselves out. Neither of us could believe it. We looked at each other, and then we gingerly slid our way out the window and fell onto our hands and knees in the lawn. We ran as hard as we could after him, thinking that he could have only gotten so far and wouldn't have anywhere to hide once we had him trapped down there at the reservoir. The harsh reality was that we would never have saw Alan again after that. We looked in every nook and cranny and screamed his name like bloody murder into the early morning air. All to no avail. For the second time that night, he had lured us down there, only to disappear. I was lost. I was so angry. I wanted so desperately for Alan to be around so I could take it all out on him. He'd done it. He'd found a way to break us even more than he already had earlier in the night. I turned back to our house and screamed his name one more time. Alan! I saw the first of the orange flames rising over the roof shortly before I smelled the smoke. I marched back towards our house like I was in a daze. The flames grew higher and higher, and by the time I reached the back fence, it was like the whole thing had been engulfed in one giant fireball. The house was the last thing he could take from us. What a show he'd put on doing it. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I answered it without looking. Alan laughed wildly on the other line. I fell to my knees and I kept listening. The fire had grown taller than the trees. Tate and I spent the next several hours at the police station, sitting in a gray room with nothing but 4 chairs, a metal table, and a circular wall clock next to the door. I don't think the cops ever really suspected us of being guilty of starting the fire, but we definitely raised some eyebrows when we gave our rendition of the events that led up to it. The problem was simple. There was physical evidence to contradict the story we gave them. Once they told us what they knew, they even showed us the evidence in pictures. There was nothing more we could have said to explain ourselves. Alan couldn't have been responsible for tormenting us all night and then ultimately burning down our house because he had been murdered shortly after he told us that he needed to check something in his car. The car he was talking about was really that black van I saw parked in the street in front of our house. It belonged to some drug kingpin who Alan begged to follow him over, promising him that he could get the money from us to pay his debts. The amount he owed was in the 6-digit range. It's the only way that so many higher-ups would have been involved firsthand. Alan must have had a change of heart when he stepped in and saw us, nervous for his visit, and he went back out to plead his case. They dragged him back inside the van, and they slit his throat right on the spot. The police knew about this hours before we called to report the fire. They caught the 2 cronies tasked with dumping Alan's body in a park a couple of blocks over. They already had his body in the morgue. They had the 2 criminals in for questioning. They were selling everyone out well before we were even on their radar. The debt had been worth more than Alan's life alone. He'd been too big of a problem for them for too long. They wanted ours as well. At first, they stormed the house expecting to gun us down while we ate, unsuspectingly, at the dinner table. Of course, we'd been lured down to the reservoir at the time. They must have just missed us giving the timeline, and they decided to rob us of everything we had before coming back to us later. It took 7 men several hours to board up all the exits in our house quietly in the night without us hearing it. But they were sure that they got every exit. Most certainly my bedroom window. There was no way that we would have been able to get the boards off from the inside. They torched the house after they heard us yelling and running up the stairs, thinking that they would sit and listen to us scream. Only by some miracle did we head down to the reservoir for the second time. They checked my phone for the call logs from Alan, and there was nothing. His phone had been smashed shortly after they'd killed him and tossed into the street. You could still hear his wild laughter in my head, and yet there was no way he could have called. There was no way he could have been back at the window or back inside of our house. There was no way that he was ever actually down at the reservoir. Perhaps he truly did love us. Hey there, kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I wanted to tell you thank you for listening to tonight's story on the podcast if you're listening on Spotify, or to the videos if you're listening on YouTube. And if you're listening anywhere else, then probably let them know that they're not supposed to have this there because it's only supposed to be on Spotify or YouTube or wherever podcasts go, or, you know. I also want to give a very big thank you shout out to all of you guys out there on Patreon. If you guys want to check out patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, you're able to support the show, support me, support my cats, support, you know, being cool folks out there, like people like these. Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Mr. Thud, Ken Lando Higuchi, Chompski, Bobby Karman, Nico Kaeo, Tristain Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, Raven Hart, 1-800-Nightmare, King Hades F13, Unknown Nobody, Joshua Mcmeekin, Michael Scharbrough, Kazan, ThisIsMyRealNameNoShit, Jason VB Wilson, InfernalOne, Lilwulfgaming, JimboTheHutt, Caspian, Jordan Nells, Hades Nephew, Jordan Wayne Deckard, Bradley Leipe, and Charron, AcidSystem, Mike Bullock, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Brian Arse, Cryptic Nightmares, Brianna Wright, Someone You Love, S-Man, Kiri the Sloth, Thomas Burgett, Liam Newman, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Nina Smith, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. Thank you guys so much for your support on Patreon. Like, I really can't thank you enough. And everybody who's down there in the description, thank you guys so much as well. And everybody who's not on either of those tiers, who just have $1 on Patreon, I can't thank you guys, like, for making these past 10 years incredible. This entire time I've ever spent on YouTube, on podcasting, everything amazing. And all of you who are at home listening, thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful, happy holidays and sweet dreams.